Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Free Speech Forward podcast and back to another one of the episodes in our special series where we are exploring and celebrating the Declaration of Independence and this 250th anniversary birthday for the United States. And today we have a really special show. I'm really honored that we have our guest, Lawrence Reed, visiting with us today to share with us some thoughts and reflections about this momentous anniversary that we're celebrating, about the significance of the founding of the United States, and of course about the importance of free speech, which we are all about on this particular podcast. And I'm delighted now to turn it over to my co-host and co-founder, Chris, who will give you Larry's formal introduction, if he even does need an introduction, and we will jump right into our conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joy. And thanks, Larry, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's great to have you. Well, as Joy said, we've got Lawrence, or he goes by Larry as well, Reed, who is the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEES, President Emeritus, Humphrey's Family Senior Fellow, and Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty. Larry has previously served as the president of FEE from 2008 to 2019 and chaired their board of trustees in the 1990s, as well as been both writing and speaking for FEE since the late 1970s. So very formative in the organization's rise to its prominence in the liberty movement here in America today. And prior to becoming FEE's president, he served for 21 years as founding president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. He also taught economics full-time from 1977 to 1984 at Northwood University in Michigan and chaired its Department of Economics from 1982 to 1984. Larry has been a champion for liberty his entire life, authoring nearly 2,000 newspaper columns and articles in magazines and journals across the United States and abroad. He has recently co-authored or authored 8 books, including his most recent one being Was Jesus a Socialist? And Real Heroes Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. So Larry, with that illustrious, and there's a lot more to be said about him. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to his website at lawrencereed.com. We'll include it in the show notes, or at fee.org, their organization's official page. So with that, I will hand it over to you now, Larry. We always like to start off by hearing kind of the origin story, if you will, of our guests and hear how you became an advocate for a free society, and perhaps even while doing so, what that phrase free society even means to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Joya. I appreciate that very kind introduction. Just one minor correction. My website has a W in there. It's lawrencewreed.com.
Yes, thank you for the correction.
I'm not sure what would happen if you left that out. Probably would just show up as a blank. But anyway, I just wanted to mention
We'll
that.
make sure to have the right one in the notes that we distribute.
Okay, appreciate it. Well, I guess my origin story goes back to my, at least in terms of my advocacy for liberty, to the 1960s, the late 60s, when as a teenager, I sort of came alive to things like current events. 1968 was such a tumultuous year all over the world. And you saw the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. That in particular really galvanized me because I had been cheering for the Czechs all year as what was known as Prague Spring sort of unfolded, where the new leadership of the regime in Prague was challenging Soviet rule and beginning to move the country toward greater freedoms of speech and press and assembly, and even near the end, before the invasion, talking about having free elections, which was unheard of in the Soviet bloc. So when the Soviets invaded, I really became active. I saw that as a horrendous event, people who simply wanted to speak their minds, to determine who represents them in their government, basic rights. The Soviet Union sends in tanks and troops and guns to crush that. And, I was only, 14 at the time, thereabouts. And that was a wake-up call. It made me realize not everybody in the world lives with as much freedom as we have here in America, far from it. And so I began reading more than ever in history, and my belief in liberty then sort of blossomed. I had good instincts too, I think, planted by my father
Mm.
over the years. That's another story, but I think he was a big help. And so I chose my undergraduate college based upon a professor I had heard as a speaker at an event because he was such an advocate for liberty. And that was Grove City College, where for 4 years I learned free market economics and the importance of a free society. And then I decided in some way or another after graduation, I was going to make a career out of advancing liberty. I didn't know yet whether that would be as running think tanks or as a professor. And in the end, I've been both. And I have a ninth book coming out, by the way, on the very subject of our topic today. It's coming out in April, entitled Born of Ideas. And it's all about the origin of America and the ideas that animated the founders and the Declaration of Independence in particular. So I guess I've been a lifelong advocate for liberty. I'm otherwise unemployable. I don't know what I would do if I weren't advancing liberty. It's that important to me, and I think it's crucially important to human society.
Thank you for sharing your origin story. I definitely want to pick up on this idea of your book because I think it's going to make a beautiful segue for the entire topic of our conversation and what we're celebrating here. But before we do, I do want to ask you one question, just because, as you pointed out, you've had this career that spanned so many facets of liberty advocacy. You did all the things from being a professor to being an author to running the think tank. So I'm curious, one, if you have any favorites among those, and also which you think has been most effective and maybe might be most effective for the world going forward. We might be moving into a future where perhaps being a professor wasn't what it was when you
Yeah.
were coming of age and doing your graduate work, perhaps. So I'm really curious, just based on all of your years of experience and everything you've done, what you think has been or might be most effective, and what might be your favorite, if that's something different.
Oh, that's a great question. Right out of graduate school, I went into teaching at the college level for 7 years. And you might not think it today, perhaps, but at that time, I was a very shy person. And the thought of getting up in front of a large audience, was a little intimidating. But those 7 years of teaching taught me to get over that pretty quick. And so that gave me some lifelong skills, not only in public speaking, but I think also in dealing with people, students in particular. So that was
Mm.
very valuable. And then after that, running the Mackinac Center in Michigan, I had to get interested in policy, even though my expertise, I think by that point, was more in ideas, history, economics.
Mm.
But running an organization wasn't something I set out in life to do, but I have found myself doing that
Mhm.
from time to time, including at the Mackinac Center. And we really made a huge impact in the state of Michigan. But I would have to say my years with FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, might be the most personally rewarding and maybe the most effective. And that's because in one way or another, I've been with FEE longer than anything. I started writing and speaking for FEE in the late 70s, chaired its board in the 90s, and served as president for 12 years. And now, since 2019, I've been president emeritus, a very active one. And I say that that might be the most effective of those various positions because our focus is on young people. It's not on policymakers, it's not on politicians, but on young people who haven't yet made up their mind and may have never heard ideas of freedom and free markets. And it's so gratifying to see them come alive for these ideas when they attend a webinar or an in person event that FEE has somewhere every week all over the world.
Thank you. Well, and I think I would love to connect this then even to our topic, because I know when I've spoken with young people, unfortunately, I get the impression that many of them seem to neither know nor care about what happened 250 years ago. There's this sense of, oh my goodness, 250 years ago. I mean, when you were describing your personal story, for them, things that happened in the 60s were ancient history, let
Yeah.
alone what might have happened 250 years ago. And there's this sense that, well, that was in the past. They didn't have cell phones and they didn't have AI. And what does this have to do with us and our upcoming generation and the future we're building? So I'm curious to hear how you answer that. And maybe that's even something that came out in, it sounds like, this new book that you have.
Well, I guess I would start by saying to a young person who might raise those issues, I might say that, well, an awful lot of what you have today that you cherish, such as the freedoms you still have, and all the things that that makes possible, you have those things in large part because of what those men and women did 250 years ago. And it's only natural for a good and decent person to be grateful, to be the beneficiary of such wonderful gifts bestowed upon us by people who put everything on the line 2.5 centuries ago. I would stress to them the importance of knowing your history, because to a great extent, we are the product of our history. Now, we're always, shaping our future, and that makes us different today than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. But still, in the background are those formative influences that came down to us through our parents and grandparents and so forth, and ultimately in America from the generations that gave this country its birth in 1776. That's mighty important stuff. People who forget their history, I mean, if you don't know where you were, then how on earth are you going to know where you ought to be in the future?
That's well said. And I think that I would venture to guess it might tie to a lot of what your upcoming book is going to be about. But I certainly operate under a theory that a lot of history and the forces of history is really the history of ideas and how
Yeah.
ideas shape human lives and actions and decisions, both at the individual and then ultimately the societal level. So
Yeah.
I just wonder if you if you think about how, part of the value of ideas and studying ideas is that they allow us to kind of transcend the concretes of the current age, whatever the dominant technology or cultural trend is, and step back to kind of more general abstractions and principles. So I wonder if you could speak to how you think the principles of the Declaration, how we can revive an understanding and awareness and appreciation for those principles, and how they might then even be applied to some of today's conflicts, like the tribalism and talking past each other that seems to plague so many of our contemporary conversations and cultural divides.
This matter, Chris, that you've brought up of ideas, their importance is really understated for most people. They don't typically understand just how powerful ideas are. Victor Hugo, the great French author, is famous for having said, ideas are more powerful than all the armies of the world. Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. When I used to teach at the college level, I would ask my freshman students a series of questions, hoping they would get to a single one-word answer. I would start by saying, well, what makes the world go round? Well, that's, you could assume anything about that question, but I'd get more specific with each one thereafter. I would say, what determines whether a people have this system or that system that governs them? What determines whether people live in a free society or an unfree society, or who they vote for, who they don't vote for? Those kinds of questions. And typically the answers at first would be things like institutions. The students would say, oh, well, it's government makes those decisions, or it's the media, or it's the church, or it's my parents. And I kept pressing them, saying, no, I'm getting at something here even more fundamental than any of these things you're mentioning. And ultimately, usually, somebody would raise their hand and say, ideas. And that's when I would say, you're exactly right. We are creatures who think, who reason, or at least we have the capacity to. Not everybody does all the time.
Yeah.
But we have that unique capacity as human beings to think our way through things, to develop new concepts, to innovate and invent, and so forth. Um, so what people think up here has an awful lot of say, maybe the determining factor in how they behave and what institutions they embrace, how they vote, whether they live free or not. So ideas really are critical. But then close behind them is something else I'd like to talk about that you saw a lot of at the time of America's founding. You saw a lot of focus on ideas and this second element, which is personal character.
Hmm.
In 1776, you have this incredible combination in this moment of history of generally high character and appreciation for high character, and also appreciation for ideas, especially new and revolutionary ones. Our founders often said, in so many words, that people who don't have high character, who are not, say, honest, responsible, courageous, grateful, uh, those other elements of strong personal character. People who don't have those things, who are dishonest, irresponsible, ungrateful, impatient, and so forth, they're not likely to be free. They're not fit to be free if they don't have those qualities, including respect for the lives and the property and the choices of their fellow citizens. So you had this incredible combination of men and women of solid character, uh, and you had revolutionary ideas of where human rights come from and what the role of government should be. All that came together like a thunderclap on July 4, 1776. And it is a unique and far reaching contribution to the world that people for centuries on will, I think, always appreciate.
Well,
Yeah. Oh, good.
do you have a follow-up, or I was going to go ahead? Sorry.
I did have one, and I just was curious. That's beautifully put, and I love that connection to character and freedom. It's definitely a theme of ours at 1776 forward. I am curious your thoughts on if there is any one idea or theme kind of that's within the Declaration, whether it be explicitly stated or perhaps implicitly kind of inferred from the Declaration, that you think in particular might help people kind of appreciate uh, the value for communication and how we can speak better with each other to bridge partisan divides.
Yeah, I think the idea that was most revolutionary and had the greatest impact and continues to reverberate coming from the Declaration would be the notion of where rights come from. And also the fact that our founders said in so many words that rights were not by group. It's not like, you have rights if you're a member of a certain group, but you don't have them if you're from some other group.
Mm,
Rights were individual. They belonged to each of us individually. And then they went further and did a revolutionary thing. They dethroned the government as a source of those rights. They
mm,
asserted that if government does its job, it will protect those rights, but it doesn't grant them.
mm-hmm,
Whoever says I'm the king, usually because his daddy or granddaddy or somebody in the distant past beat enough people up that he got to be the king. Whoever is the guy at the top, he's not some special person who doesn't put his pants on one leg at a time like the rest of us. If he does his job, he will protect the rights of all of us. That implies things like a police function of government, a national defense function, courts, and a law code and a rule book, you might say. But our founders went further than anybody had before and said, but rights are inherent in each of us. They come from our Creator, who created our very nature. And one of the most incredible elements of that nature is our uniqueness. The fact that each and every one of us, there are 8 billion on the planet today, who knows how many more came in the past. So there are billions of people, and our founders understood that no two of them were precisely alike.
Mhm.
They are all individual and unique. And that has huge implications for personal freedom. Because if we weren't that way, if we were just a bunch of robots, just copies of each other, then what case would you have for
Yeah,
liberty? You would have
right.
a case for a good programmer who would tell us what to do. But we're not that way. So that means that each of us, in order to be fully himself or herself, has to have a great measure of freedom of choice. That's how we know who you are. You manifest your character and your persona by the choices that you make, and you can
Hmm.
only make them in an environment of freedom from intimidation and oppression.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to connect this then with you described so poetically July 4th, 1776 as this thunderclap where people of good ideas and with good character came together to create the Declaration to give us these fundamental freedoms. And this is something that Chris and I have been speaking about. We recently did a podcast of our own thinking about the significance of the fact that it was a declaration, an
Yeah.
act of speech, an act of free speech, which we use to mark the birth of this country, because it didn't have to be that way. We could have marked this with the first shots fired at Lexington Concord. We could have marked this with the end of the war, or the beginning of the Constitution, or the election of Washington. But instead, as you noted, the moment that we celebrate is July 4th, 1776, and the Declaration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about free speech, which is what our show is all about, and why freedom of speech is so central. Clearly, this is one that our founders recognized. It's certainly up there in the Constitution. I think it is there implicitly in the Declaration itself, in the very fact that it is a declaration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, on the significance of freedom of speech in terms of these fundamental freedoms that you're pointing out that the founders recognized and gave to us to inherit.
Yeah, free speech is so important. It should never be considered, just a luxury or a side issue, or nice if you have it, no big deal if you don't. Uh-uh. Free speech is fundamental to a free society. A free society means that people can go about their business in peace, live their lives, so long as they do no harm to others, so long as they respect the lives and the rights and the property of other people. They should be able to live in peace. Well, one of the ways you exercise choice is by what you say, by how you think. And just think, if you lived in, say, we'll take a worst case scenario, North Korea today, where just thinking something and saying it can get you thrown in prison or worse. You're not really you anymore. You're somebody else is living their life through you, intimidating you at every turn, telling you what to say and to think. You might as well be a robot. Um, so free speech is the verbal manifestation of the freedom to think, which is derived directly from who you are, a unique and precious individual, never to be repeated, and with unalienable rights, as our founding fathers put it. So free speech is a cherished institution. We should never allow it to be compromised.
Yeah, and picking up on what Joya said, we certainly agree. And when we did our own reflections on the Declaration, that was one of, I think, the most striking aspects, is this making this connection between America's founding moment as an act of speech, and then I think, if not perhaps explicitly, intuitively, the founders recognized the what you just said, the primacy of speech as an expression of individuality, in by putting it in the first among all of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, that kind
That's
of
right.
explicitly elucidated at least many of the core rights, or as we like to kind of refer to it in our work, the derivative rights that flow from the fundamental ones of life, liberty, property, and pursuit of happiness, that the Declaration did explicitly outline. But maybe picking up on that very idea right there, the Declaration does famously start with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," but you know, if you think about it, if they really were self-evident, then there would have been no need for a declaration and a revolution, right? So, and we know that uh, to pick up on the theme of ideas, that they are not always clear, explicit, self-evident, that the search for truth requires a kind of iterative and exploratory and often error-prone process. So I'm just curious if you can reflect on that, and how you think the search for truth and the right of free speech are tied to each other.
I think it's important to tie those opening words, we hold these truths to be self evident, to the very title of the document, declaration. I mean, that is an emphatic term. They didn't title the document a list of suggestions to think about, or what do you think? You know, they
A
understood that.
treatise.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, the Declaration is not a Dale Carnegie course. You know, it's
Right.
they wanted to come out and say, "Doggone it, this is the way we see it. This is the way the world ought to see it." And
Mm,
we are declaring it. We're not just hiding behind a bush and throwing it out there to see what you think.
mm,
And
I like that.
they said that these truths were self-evident, but they knew that not everybody saw it that way. I mean, the king of Great Britain didn't see these truths as self-evident. The British Army didn't, for the most part. Um, Lots of people didn't. This was revolutionary stuff. They wanted to educate people at the same time they were making a statement about where they were taking the country. They wanted people to kind of, they wanted a light to go on in their head that would say, wow, I thought everything came from the king. I thought he ruled by divine right. I thought that we were just to do whatever he told us. I thought our rights came from Parliament. You know, no, our founders emphatically made some declarations about new principles that they were hoping the world would embrace.
Mm.
And fortunately, Americans came to embrace them, and many others around the world did in subsequent years as well. But uh, it's not self evident to everybody that we have unalienable rights. It's not self evident that government has certain functions to perform and lines it should not cross. But these were things that our founders wanted the world to know emphatically.
And I guess as the Declaration, that's wonderfully put. And I guess to your point, as the Declaration beautifully illustrates, it's when you have the freedom, or in this case, when you take the freedom to make that declaration and to express that principle outwardly, that is how you start to change hearts and minds of other people, and just by exposing them to alternative ideas.
That's right. And, you know, we should add, too, that the founders knew that what they were doing was treasonous in the eyes of the British government. So they just couldn't come out with some half-hearted list of suggestions. They
Mm,
saw this, hey, this is a pivotal moment. We are, in effect, going to war.
yeah.
And we want the people to know emphatically what it is we're going to war for. And we hope they'll get excited about it because it's pretty important stuff.
And to your point on good character, I think, I mean, that to take that kind of act reflected so many great and noble character virtues, but among them being the courage in the face of that kind of known treasonous act they were taking, and then the responsibility of, I think, taking on the responsibility for the consequences of taking that action.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I think everybody would say a person who, let's say, escapes from tyranny or escapes from slavery is, in that moment at least, a kind of hero, takes courage to do such things. But our founders they took it to the next level. I think if you pressed any of them, they would say, well, we're not just doing this for we as individuals, for just our freedom. We're interested in the freedom of others. You know, we could have freedom ourselves if we just moved west out to the plains, and the Brits would never get us. But no, we're doing this because we want freedom for all the people ultimately within the jurisdiction of the new country that we're creating. Now, people will say, well, but they left out certain groups, and yeah, you could say they took freedom further and for more people than anybody else previously in history. but they also told us the work isn't done. We've given you a system whereby you can take it even further. And there were
Mm.
some who were really eager to see that happen.
I would really love to pick up on this point because this is certainly something that I've come across in conversations with others. You've emphasized the importance of good ideas and good character and mentioning the founders as people who have solid character. And something that I've seen, unfortunately, speaking with young people, they do not see the founders in that light, maybe based on the ideas that they were taught or certain ideas that they've absorbed from the culture, that they do not think of the founders as being people of good character. Perhaps because of this reason, this is what you always hear. Well, oh, the founders, they owned slaves, so how can we trust these people? Their character is tarnished right from the start, from that act of racism, perhaps, and the fact of owning slaves. So I'm curious then how you would respond to that. And maybe if you could even say more about what it is that actually makes a person someone of good character and why we should think of the founders as being people of good character.
Well, that matter of writing off the founders or dismissing them or diminishing them because they weren't perfect, because they didn't go the full distance for everybody in one fell swoop, is to commit the sin of what we call presentism, which is to judge those of the past by the conventions of the present. It's a failure to understand how things really happen in human society. We don't pop out of the womb with a complete understanding of every aspect of sociology and politics and economics. I mean, we have to learn and grow. And when you look throughout history, you'll find that things like slavery were common, widely accepted, and had been around for centuries. Almost every people were engaged in it. And so when somebody comes along and says, well, we have doubts about that, and we're going to try to move things in the right direction, we shouldn't say, well, unless you're prepared to go the full distance all at once, well, then you're no better than anybody else. I mean, that's so short-sighted. It would be like if we could call the Wright brothers, who invented the airplane, to the present day, put them in a courtroom and say, all right, you guys created this rickety flying machine. You didn't have tray tables. You didn't have laptops. You didn't have Wi-Fi. You didn't have movies. You didn't have anything in there. What good are you? Well, that's to completely dismiss their contribution. So to take it to the founders, yeah, many of them wanted to get rid of things like slavery entirely, but they had to make some compromises because not everybody in society had intellectually and spiritually and by other measures moved that far yet along. So they made some compromises, but they did put into the Constitution in the late 1780s a provision to end the trade in slaves in 1807. And some states had already begun to abolish slavery. Vermont was the first to do it in 1777, long before the war was even settled. So they move things in the right direction, further than anybody in the past had ever done. And for that, we should be grateful. But they would have been the first to say, our fellow Americans, take it from here, extend its guaranteed liberties as far as you can, and as soon as you can. We've given you a fantastic start.
Well, and as you note, there were many statements and principles laid down in that declaration that provided that roadmap and inspiration, right, for throwing off the chains of oppression that one may find themselves under, under government. And we did ultimately follow. I like to think, I think history has proven that because of those principles and the system that they laid down, we were able to get rid of the remaining vestiges of slavery within our confines.
Exactly. The Declaration itself became the core of the abolitionist argument in the 19th century. And abolitionists who wanted to take liberty to its logical conclusion and emancipate slaves, they often referred back to the Declaration and would tell people, look at the wording. It says, all men are created equal. It doesn't say certain men. So our founders kind of expect us to live up to that and to take it to its logical conclusion. So the Declaration resonated very much in the 19th century.
So as we close out our conversation, we like to go through this question, and I think it's particularly relevant here in the year 2026 as we are celebrating the quarter millennia of America's birth and existence. It really is a spectacular milestone. And one of the themes of our work at 1776 Forward is kind of an entrepreneurial approach to politics and philosophy and ideas. And Joy and I often reflect on how I think you even used the phrase creating a nation, the Declaration, how the founding of America was very much, yes, it was a political project, but it was also an entrepreneurial project because it was an experiment in a new method of organizing society and governing human affairs. And so, with that entrepreneurial spirit in mind, just curious if resources were no object or limiting factor, if you have any thoughts or kind of blue sky ideas on what would be the most impactful project you could invest in to further advance understanding and awareness of the founding ideals, and just, I guess, embedded within that, the importance of free speech and free expression, which is kind of our theme here on this show.
Well, I'm glad you included the adjective blue sky, because some of these things, like the one I'm about to mention, are always far easier said than done. But if what I would love to see, there's no factor in the outcome of the educational experience for young people that is more powerful, more consequential to the outcome of one's education than parental involvement. And what I would love to see is maybe a 2 hour evening course for parents, and have it just all over the country, work with local civic groups that might want to sponsor them locally, where you walk parents through in a couple of hours how to educate their youngsters in the importance of America's Declaration and America's founding. Uh, we can't count on the schools to do that. Some do it, some don't. Some do it in ways that are actually harmful.
Mm-hmm.
But if students at a young age could hear from their parents, hey, here's what we ought to be reading. Here are some thoughts that you should give a lot of further thought to. Here's why America is so exceptional. I think giving parents those tools so they don't just simply say, well, I don't know anything about that, I'll let the schools do it.
Mm-hmm.
That could have a tremendous impact. I'd love to see students go to school and challenge some of the teachers and say, hey, I understand that rights don't come from the government
Mm-hmm.
and that our founder said so. So I guess if I had my druthers, I would somehow try to get groups of parents together all over this country and give them the wherewithal, the confidence, the resources, the articles, the books, whatever. In a 2 hour course, you can do it in an evening, that will help them teach their children what they need to know.
I love that. And this is one of the reasons why we love this question, because we always get such different, varied, but inspiring ideas always. And that is a first. And I actually think a really, really important and overlooked area for education.
There may be no better time to start such a venture than right now, because you're going to get a lot of people fired up in the next few months for our 250th anniversary. We just got to get them to realize that that should not just be seen as an opportunity for a lot of fireworks, but rather should be seen as an opportunity to educate our kids in these exciting, incredible values that made us so exceptional. Don't pass that off to somebody else to do. That's part of your job as a parent. Let's get working on this.
I have to say, as a mother myself, that is definitely inspiring to me. And I already have some ideas for things that I think maybe we can do to kind of take that idea and start to make it a reality. We have plenty of time still, even before July 4th, to really make that happen. So thank you for sharing that idea. Well, we are almost out of time, unfortunately, but I would love to end by leaving you the floor to share. We'd love to end by, we know there are so many people who perhaps agree with these ideas, but in the culture we currently live in, it might take courage for them to find their voice, stand up, speak out. So we're wondering if you just have any thoughts or words of encouragement or advice for those to help them stand up and speak out for these ideas.
I guess I would say, Joya, that each of us as Americans should allow ourselves to be inspired by our founding. If ever you become a little depressed or discouraged, or if you feel like, oh, that would take more courage than I have to do, well, think back to, let's say, the awful winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 78. Those men who froze and starved and made it through, a lot of them didn't, but those who did, they weren't doing it because they ultimately wanted an iPhone or 3 meals every day and at gourmet restaurants. They were doing it for a principle of individual liberty. That's exciting stuff. Life without liberty is just absolutely unthinkable. So if they could give their all for these principles, then maybe we complain too much. Maybe we need to be as inspired about these ideas today as they were 250 years ago.
Beautifully, beautifully put. Thank you for sharing that and for those words. I think it's an inspiring call to action for all of us as we reflect on this glorious milestone achievement of our country. So thank you for your time, Larry. It's been a pleasure. And as always, for all of our listeners out there, you can find us on these videos linked through our website at 1776forward.com or our co-sponsoring institution, Institute for Liberal Values website, ilvalues.org, and on all major podcast channels under ILV's Dissidents channel. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Chris. Thank you, Joya.